So this month, I'm very pleased to welcome Gethin Nadin. He's the Director of Employee Wellbeing at Benefex, and he's helped some of the world's largest organisations improve their employee wellbeing and experience over the last 20 years. Of course, happy and engaged employees mean hopefully happy customers. So without further ado, I hand over to you, Gethin.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Mark, for having me on this learning session. Hello, everyone, wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much for joining us. And welcome to Successful Customer Experiences Begin with the Employee Experience. I think it's fair to say the workplace has changed a lot this year, perhaps forever. But so much so that 83% of employers say they expect remote working to change how they operate in the future. And an impressive 70% of employers say that this year they found better ways of working during the lockdown. We've also seen this year that research houses like Gartner have found that 64% of HR leaders say they now plan to prioritize the employee experience more highly than they did before the pandemic. And so today I'm going to be talking about how you can use better employee experience design to drive improved customer experiences, higher productivity, and more loyalty. Before we get started, I just wanted to explain a little bit about me. I'm a psychologist who's been working in HR technology for 20 years. I'm a regular writer and commentator on HR, employee experience, and employee wellbeing, and I guest write for a number of HR publications throughout Europe. I'm also the author of a best-selling HR book, A World of Good, and I'm also chair of the UK Engaged Success Thought Action Group for Wellbeing, which is a government-sponsored thought leadership group. And I've also been lucky enough to be nominated as one of the world's leading employee engagement influencers for the last 2 years running. But for the last 9 years, I've been part of the senior management team at Benefex, and a global employee experience technology business looking after our approach to wellbeing. For the last 5 years or so, I think there's been a significantly growing trend for more transparency at work. Online employee review sites like Glassdoor, social media, and a more empowered workforce means we've evolved to a place where your employment practices are no longer secret and where the employee is no longer afraid to speak out about poor experiences they have with their employers. Anyone who's on Twitter will see that it's awash with disgruntled and poorly treated employees willing to talk about what it was like to work at a company and the bad ways that they've been treated. And in fact, there's probably barely a day that goes by when somebody doesn't send me a tweet or a LinkedIn update that exposes some horrible experience an employee's had at work. But it's not just social media that pick up on these stories. The widestream media pick these up too, and within hours, one tweet can become headline news and an employer's poor practices exposed. And in 2020, all of this is on display for your customers to see. There's some great examples that have appeared over the last couple of years about how this has happened in operation. We saw a New Zealand roofer who called in sick to work was texted back by his boss, toughen up and come in. And that employee has been awarded $20,000 after his story went viral last year. You've probably read in the global news that television star in the US, Ellen DeGeneres, has had to come out to publicly apologize for the working culture on her show after stories emerged of bullying and harassment. And so now brands all over the world are dealing with the fact that if you harm an employee, if you fail to look after them and their well-being, or if you put them in harm's way, the world soon it. And when that happens, it can have a disastrous effect on brands. And we've seen over the last couple of years, brands like Amazon, Wells Fargo, Sports Direct, and Uber have all been taken to the court of public opinion by the media, exposing their poor workplace practices. And so your employee experience is now on show for everybody to see, and your customers are starting to play a role in making sure that employers support their staff. And this change in how we perceive the workplace has led to a much more conscious consumer that cares about how a brand treats its people. Consumers now say they are more drawn to a brand by how it treats its employees than environmental issues, and that's pretty significant. The vast majority of consumers say they want brands to tell and show them how they're taking care of their people. And I think this is a really significant change and a big blurring of the lines between the consumer and employer brand and the consumer and employee experience. New research out in 2020 shows us that consumers say that a brand's care for their staff is now even more important as basic things like having the right items in stock. So your customers are now very interested in the employee experience. So it seems to me it's quite obvious that an investment in creating a good experience at work is now much wider than HR and filters into lots of areas of the business to do with customer experience, customer loyalty, and finance, revenue, productivity, etc. The pandemic has also completely exacerbated this fast-growing trend. It's resulted in rapid, unprecedented changes in consumer behaviours and preferences. And almost overnight, right across the globe, we started to care for each other more as we all started to face this pandemic together. And consumers became concerned for those key workers forced to keep working during the pandemic. And we discovered this newfound respect for delivery drivers and retail workers. And we all realised how important these people are to our lives and the smooth running of our societies. And we wanted to make sure that these people were looked after so well that they in turn could look after us. And as I mentioned, this is a significant turning point in consumer behaviour. Overnight, we saw people buying from brands they'd never bought from before just because of how they saw the way they treated their employees during the pandemic. And so this has led to quite a significant change in 2020 in what consumers now expect from brands. Unruly, part of ad technology company Tremor International, fielded a global survey of 3,000 people asking them about how their viewing habits have changed and their preferences about things like television advertising. And the survey found that in the US, the consumer's top suggestion was that brands should share on television how they're supporting their staff. Twitter did some similar research and found that 80% of their users now believe that brands should show how they supported their people during the pandemic. And the majority of young consumers say that they are now more likely to trust a brand if they supported their staff during lockdown. So we started to see this year that growing trend completely accelerated, and we now know almost for a fact that consumers want to know that you've been taking care of your people this year and the coming years as we go through the recovery from this pandemic. And so during the pandemic, again, customers were asked what the considerations they were giving to brands because of the pandemic. And as we saw, our news channels were flooded with stories of panic buying and stockpiling. So it's probably expected that having the things in consumers actually needed in stock was going to be one of the largest considerations. But again, far and above prices, safety and cleanliness, and again, stock availability, taking care of employees ranked among the highest consideration. So around 50% of consumers say that they consider whether or not a company takes care of their employees as one of their top 5 purchasing considerations. And that's, again, a really significant change in consumer behaviour, and one that I think will continue for so long that it will become an expectation at work. 84% of respondents to this study said that they are more likely to buy from companies that treat their workers with flexibility and empathy. And we've started to see consumers even taking note of things like paid sick leave policies, for instance. So 78% of consumers say they are more likely to buy from a company that offers paid sick leave. Consumers are now voting with their feet, and that is having an impact on HR policy. And again, I think that's really, really significant. And another growing trend right across the world is what your employees are saying about you online is having a huge effect on your customers and their experience of buying from you. Consumers are checking your Glassdoor ratings and Twitter interactions way before the pandemic hit us all. But what we've seen from the pandemic is a significantly more active consumer who's more interested in knowing about what it's like to work for you and how you take care of your people before they even consider buying from you. And we've seen record numbers of consumers start to buy from brands because of how they treated their people during the pandemic. And so I believe this pandemic will bolster the growing trend of employee advocacy and the importance of using your employee voice as part of your consumer brand. And as I mentioned at the start, we live in this age of transparency that will only get more see-through. The future of the workplace, I think, will be about more openness, well-being, reward and benefits, salaries. I think this will all start to be on show for everybody to see. A simple click of a review site or a browse of Twitter will start to reveal the ugly truth about what it's like to work for you. And I think that will continue to affect consumer habits. And it's important to note that whether you are B2B or B2C, and in fact, I think even more so if you're B2B, because your business will be seen as more of a group of people in a B2B transaction than just a consumer transaction. And so when you take care of your people, when you invest in their health, well-being and happiness, they will talk about that. And so the way you support your people will be on record for all to see. And if you do that, you need to make sure our customers see that. When we see stories shared online by employees working for organizations, they get 8 times more engagement when the same brand shares that same content. Employee stories and employee voice stretches much further than the brand voice, and now more than 70% of customers say their perception of a brand is determined by the experiences they had with the people that work for you. Unhappy, unwell, or stressed employees cannot deliver the same levels of high service that you need them to. And when workplaces have wellbeing initiatives, they make business sense, and many of you will have some kind of wellbeing strategy, whether that's been formalized or not. And when employees have wellbeing at work, they become significantly more likely to talk about their positive experience at the workplace. And we now have vast and growing evidence of a strong link between employee wellbeing and customer satisfaction. So the more employees feel cared for and looked after, the higher an organization's Glassdoor rating. The higher your Glassdoor rating, the higher your customer satisfaction scores. And this makes, as I mentioned before, employee wellbeing is not just a HR issue, but is a big customer experience issue too. And even before the pandemic hit, employees globally were starting to realize the importance of working for an employer that actually cared about them. Surveys and research around the world started to show that people want to work for an employer who takes care of their mental health, who supports and encourages them when they are struggling, and an employer that genuinely cares about them. But when the pandemic hit and employees really started to see their employers were actually caring about them and whether they were really supportive or whether this previous work had just been lip service. I think this pandemic has become a forced experiment in how we should look after employee well-being and look after our people, how we create great employee experiences, and how important that is to the consumer. And I think as the lasting effects of the pandemic will be felt among your consumers and employees for some time to come, we're probably just at the start of that process that I think will be forcing employers to take better care of their people, or they risk being left behind. And some very early case studies of this emerged at the start of lockdown. So one of the first examples of a brand coming out and showing how they were going to support their staff during the pandemic was restaurant chain Leon. Leon made very quick decisions around wanting to stay open despite it costing them more than closing their restaurants. But they made the decision to give the choice to stay at home or work to the employee and made it clear that they would support the employee whatever decision they made. But they told their staff that if they did come to work, they would only be making meals for the NHS in the UK, and any profit they made during lockdown would be donated to charity, so that any employee that wanted to come to work would be doing it to help others. Another example of an employer who used how they were supporting their employees to bolster their efforts to retain customers and business during the pandemic was a UK discount retailer called Home Bargains. And before many other retailers followed, Home Bargains made a very public commitment to making sure their employees didn't suffer financially because of lockdown and isolation. And so Home Bargains agreed to pay upfront staff who had to self-isolate by maintaining their full pay. And for those employees that never self-isolated, they've agreed to give those staff members an additional 2 weeks of full pay so they don't miss out. They also created a huge £30 million fund to support their people during the pandemic. And so it was really surprising and heartwarming to see an employer not just react very quickly to the situation and come out in complete support of their people, but to recognise very on that things like personal finances would become a very big part of this pandemic. And so after all of this evidence, it will probably come as no surprise to you that employees themselves are demanding better experiences at work as well. Most employers say their employer didn't show enough care for them during the pandemic, and most now want to work for an employer who takes care of them should something like coronavirus happen again. So because of the pandemic, employees are now more likely to say an employer has a responsibility over their well-being. And so now it's a simple case of, if you aren't a caring employer, if you aren't a boss that looks after their people and supports your people through their lives, you simply will not succeed as a business. This approach is no longer something left for the large profitable companies of Silicon Valley. It applies to every organization, whether you employ 10 people in a furniture store or 1,000 people working in a warehouse. The world of work has changed, and with it has the expectations of your employees. And so how can you help? So first of all, if you don't believe anything I've said today, if you think people come to work to do a job and get paid, and that's the start and the end of the relationship, then I'm not sure I'm ever going to change your mind. However, caring and supportive employees isn't some left-wing socialist idea anymore. It makes complete business sense. We look at new research from consulting firm Great Place to Work, and they have learned that the strongest driver of above average revenue growth among smaller businesses was a caring community at work. Employees identified caring as being more pivotal for business growth than understanding what the business strategy is, what innovation takes place in that business, and how competent leaders are. The Great Place to Work research looked at several hundred small and medium-sized organisations and looked at more than 52,000 global employee surveys. And the authors were trying to find out what are the strongest drivers of increased revenue by looking at the impact of around 60 or so questions from their annual survey. And the authors of this research found that employees were 50% more likely to work for a company with above average growth when they feel like they were being cared for. So what we started to see is that when you have a caring environment, that company is performing better. And we can look at organizations around the world and look at their group accounts, for example. Those organizations that mention the words well-being or mental health in their group reports every year perform better than the rest of the FTSE 100 or the Forbes 500 in the US. And if we look at two of the biggest workplace well-being studies that have ever been conducted in the US in 2019, they tell us that we must design the experience for the employee, not the employer. So we have to put the needs of the employee at the heart of what's it like to work with us, and then everything else starts to fall into place. And so what this means for anyone listening today is that putting the employee at the center of your experience and understanding what it's really like to work for you is really important. So, ask yourselves, do you feel like your people feel you care about them and you value them? Could they approach their manager if they were struggling with their mental health? Do they have the support available to them with the things they'd be most worried about this year, which is money, by the way? If staff members in debt need help, could you support them somehow or direct them to somebody who can? And I think those organizations that think like this and others significantly, in many cases, show 4 times the shareholder return than those who don't think about well-being and the employee experience. So again, massively compelling evidence that when you care about your people and put them at the center of your employee experience design, everything else falls into place. They deliver better customer service and increase loyalty, and that translates to higher productivity and revenue. And so for almost a decade now, the evidence has been mounting that when an employer cares for their people, they're actually caring for their business. An example from my book tells the story of a gentleman called Paul O'Neill, who became CEO of the world's leading producer of aluminium, Aloca. And he announced that his sole priority when he took over Aloca was to increase the safety of his employees. And although not well received by his board at the time, he understood that safety and well-being of the people was a concern and needed to be one of their strategic priorities. And over the next 10 years or so, employee productivity increased significantly as accident rates decreased dramatically, to some plants going years without any accidents or well-being incidents at all. And when Paul O'Neill left Aloca 10 years later, their annual income had grown by more than 500%. We have evidence for more than 6 years. Jane Dutton at the University of Michigan has studied an array of organizational settings like hospitals and universities. And she looked at businesses like Macy's in the US and Cisco. And she found that when distressed employees received acts of compassion like emotional support, time off from work, or even simple things like being given flowers, they demonstrated more positive emotions such as joy and contentment and had greater commitment towards their organization. And so it won't surprise you that there are business benefits to continuing to show more compassion at work even. A recent study published in the BMC Public Health Journal showed that when employees feel like they're bonding at work, their stress levels decrease. And decreased stress means employees are less likely to burn out and more likely to become productive. So caring for employees is no longer just the right thing to do. It actually makes very clear business sense. The links between being a caring employer and overall business success compares with multiple research in this area. People like Fortune Online describe how Google recently learned that psychological safety is the primary influence in what fuels high performance. Some of the world's largest organizations realize the importance of asking questions and listening to what employees' concerns and needs are. Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, once said, "Listen to your customers and your employees. They're the most important thing and they define your business." And so drawing on some of the themes of my book, using research from almost 400 global studies, interviews with experts and historical data, I've pulled together just some of the few ways that I think you can help your people over the coming months and years while we try to recover from the coronavirus pandemic. If you'd like to know the rest, you can buy the book. It's available on Amazon all over the world. And as you can see on screen, some people have had some good things to say about that. But I just wanted to give you kind of 4 or 5 things that you could take away today, that you could start helping your own people to have a better experience at work. Firstly, I think it's important that every employer understands a bit more about psychology. Our minds are to a certain extent finite, and research shows us that multitasking isn't a thing. We can't do it effectively. Because the brain has to move between 2 stages rapidly when we multitask, it takes quite a significant toll on our cognitive ability, and this in psychology is called the switching cost. But we also know that decision fatigue is a real thing, so the longer the day, the worse our decision making gets. And we also have this thing called ego depletion, which means our willpower wanes over time. So the longer the day goes on, the less better we get at being able to make decisions, our willpower wanes, and our switching cost starts to deteriorate. And I think this is all important for you to understand, because the better we design experiences with these things in mind, the more productive and innovative our people will be. So if you think about something like daydreaming, daydreaming is actually a very important cognitive state, but we don't allow employees to do much of that at work. The always-on nature of work and technology, especially since the start of the pandemic, when we've all had to work mostly from home, means that we've lost a lot of our natural opportunities in the workplace for our minds to wander. So we don't have the commutes to work where we might sit on a train or on a bus. We don't have the walk to work where we might just be thinking about nothing and with our headphones in. We've lost the waiting in line for a sandwich at the sandwich shop and that kind of thing. The casual encounters we have around the water cooler. All of that stuff is really important downtime that allows our minds to wander and daydream. So we need to make sure that we are encouraging our people to build those moments in and to build that time away from work into their days. And the research shows that when we do that, productivity increases significantly. And a great psychological study that looked at this studied the decision-making abilities of magistrates and judges. And after studying 1,000 decisions made over a 12-month period, the researchers found that prisoners who appeared early in the morning had their parole approved in 70% of cases, but prisoners who appeared late in the evening only had 10% parole approval rates. We can also see this in court judgments. The later in the day you're likely to be seen by a judge in any kind of court situation, the higher likelihood you'll get a sentence. Really significant. You know, people like judges, you know, you're more likely to go to prison if you see a judge later in the day than in the morning because of that decision-making ability wanes throughout the day. Our brains never stop working, they never give rest. But when we do give our minds time to relax and sort themselves out by not thinking actively, we actually perform better. And it's why things like mindfulness show such positive results. So I think encouraging your people to take breaks, no matter how small, give them the permission and the help to understand that those short breaks from work will be beneficial to their work and their productivity. And ideally, experts think we should be looking at as much as 15-minute break for every hour that we work, according to some of the latest research. So again, something you can do tomorrow is encourage your people to just take the breath, take time away from work. If they're working from home, if they're working in a shop, just take that 5 minutes away from work, even if it's not to think about anything. That's a really important cognitive state we need to get into the habit of. One of the most significant things I think we can do for our people is to recognize them for the effort that they've put in. 75% of Americans agree that if bosses want happier employees, you just have to say thank you. In humans, our productivity drive tends to be motivated by a set of overlapping natural desires, and these include a desire to contribute to a group, a desire to be challenged and mentally stimulated, and a desire to fulfill basic needs such as food, shelter, and safety. But beyond those basic needs, productive pursuits are driven by identity and emotions. So people might be motivated to complete a difficult project because it will grant them social status, for instance, or because they'll feel pride afterwards. So it's really important that we're recognized for a job well done. And it might seem like an obvious thing, but I bet most of you don't do a particularly good job of it, because in my experience, all over the world, employers don't. We don't believe that anyone comes to work to do a poor job. We feel like everybody wants to do a good job and they want to feel valued for doing so. And I think so strong is recognition that lack of it is the #1 reason why somebody leaves a role in the US. And its strength is so important to employees that most employees now say they would take more recognition over a pay rise. Recognition plays a significant part in how we feel about the work that we do and the connections that we build with our team members and our managers. And research shows us that those employees that feel a sense of belonging report higher levels of overall life satisfaction and better mental well-being. So feeling like we belong somewhere and we contribute to something is a major motivator in our lives. And when employees recognize the efforts of each other and receive recognition themselves, our sense of purpose and commitment to work starts to improve. But this connection that we start to deliver, we build with everyone else as well, is not just improving our own health, but is even reducing the frequency of physical ill health. So we know that in some cases, the more positive relationships somebody has at work, the more positive relationships that exist within an organization, the fewer sickness issues they report as a company. And the research also reveals that when employees are appreciated and connected at work, they even report happier home lives too. So make sure you thank your people this Christmas. They've worked very hard for you. They've shown themselves to be loyal and committed and extremely adaptable with the situation. And I'm sure you'll all agree that they've really supported your business when you really needed them to. Something else as well as those little breaks from work and taking little bits of time away from work, we need employees to take sustained periods of time away from work. It's something many employees have struggled to do whilst working from home, but even when they can't go to holiday or they can't go out for a meal or go to the pub, etc., that they used to, getting time away from work is still very, very important. In one study of its employees, accounting firm Ernst & Young found that for each additional 10 hours of vacation time, employee performance improved by 8%. And we could see that again, lots of different examples show us that some of the best performing employees take adequate time away from work. And despite many countries offering decent levels of holiday allowance, research reveals that employees are mostly not taking advantage of what's on offer. It's reported that a third of UK employees and 25% of US employees don't take all of their holiday entitlement. According to the CIPD in the UK, data from more than 1,000 employees reveals that a further 15% of UK employees say they only take their entitlement of annual leave because their employer forces them to. And I think this growing trend we have to be always on at work is leading to taking time off as being more important than ever. Work-related stress, anxiety, and depression are on the rise, and both employees and employers need to be taking responsibility for that. But having things like a vacation to look forward to appears to double the benefits for employees. So not only do they get time away from work for respite, they also benefit from the good feeling associated with looking forward to their time off or their holiday or their trip. There's a great author called Gretchen Rubin who states that there are 4 stages of enjoying an event like a vacation, and she calls those anticipation, savouring, expression, and reflection. And one of the most surprising stages is that anticipation of a holiday alone brings so much happiness into people's lives. And sometimes that anticipation can lead to feeling happier, even when doing the thing you're looking forward to doesn't happen. So what we tend to see is that actually employees look forward to stuff. Sometimes that's more enjoyable than the actual thing they end up doing. And there's a great story about how Winnie the Pooh does that in one of the books by A.A. Milne, where he talks about looking for honey is more exciting than when he actually finds the honey. But again, so having employees to have time off and having them, encouraging them to book things in, whether that's day outs, time with the family, cinema trips, whatever it is they can do at the moment, it's really important that people have things to look forward to as well as taking time off work. But the absence of those regular holidays and the absence of that regular time away from work can have a profound effect on our bodies. A study that investigated the reasons behind myocardial infarction or coronary death among women found that, among other things, infrequent holidays is a predictor of ill health. So encourage your employees to take time away from work. It's an important part of being creative and innovative. For the average American working in a big city, the distance between their home and public transport is just a short walk, as is the walk from public transport to the office. So for many, that means that it's very easy to go an entire day without any real fresh air. And it's commonplace for us to travel whilst inside a vehicle, work inside, exercise indoors, entertain ourselves indoors, sleep indoors on a day-to-day basis, even before the pandemic hit. And now, statistically, before the pandemic, Americans say they spend 90% of their time indoors. And many of us probably never stop to think about how much time we do spend indoors, especially in those countries where the weather usually forces us to stay in, like we have in the UK. But this year, we've seen millions of employees drastically reduce the time spent outdoors. 90% of our time indoors equates to around 22 hours a day inside. We would get more outdoor activity if we were in prison for a serious criminal act in the US than we spend as most employees. And it's been very well documented for many years that being outside and specifically close to nature has huge benefits for our well-being. The Institute for European Environmental Policy, in conjunction with Friends of the Earth Europe, considered the benefits of nature on humans. They compiled all the best research in this area, and they found that people living within 300 meters of a green space reported better self-perceived health and fewer doctor visits on average. They were prescribed fewer antidepressants, and in urban areas where more trees were living on the streets, they found the same. So just living close to green areas, we've started to see improves people's physical health. It even sees a reduction in children's behavioural problems, a reduction in the development of allergies, lower mental distress, and an increase in self-esteem. And so unsurprisingly, the research shows that the impact of employees is just as compelling. There is research that says simply having a view of nature improved an employee's productivity. In call centre environments, they found that those employees who had the best possible view could process 7 to 12% more calls than those employees that didn't have a view of nature. They also found that office workers performed 10 to 25% better on tests of mental functioning when they had a pleasant view of nature at work or they spent time in nature during their working day. And so aside from the improvement in performance, those employees with pleasant views and spent time in nature also started to improve general better health and lower fatigue. These things might seem like very small actions and seemingly insignificant, but they all add up. You might have heard of something called the aggregation of marginal gains, and that is that small improvements to something like the employee experience can add up to a significant difference overall. And a famous example is the British cycling team in the Tour de France. In 2003, a guy called Dave Brailsford became performance director for UK cycling. And up until this point, Britain hadn't won the Tour de France in Britain for more than 100 years. British cycling teams were so underwhelming at the time that even some bike manufacturers and brands didn't want British teams using their equipment in case it harmed their brand. But Brailsford was committed to a strategy called the aggregation of marginal gains. And this is the idea that if you break down every part of the race experience and improved each part by just 1%, you would get a significant increase overall. And so Brailsford and his coaches began by making small adjustments that you might expect from a professional cycling team. They redesigned bike seats to make them more comfortable, rubbed alcohol on the tyres for better grip, etc. But they didn't stop there. They started to think outside of the box. And they realised that at different points over the Tour de France, the cyclists were not staying at the same hotels, and so were not having a consistent night's sleep. So they all had their own mattresses that a van took from hotel to hotel to ensure that each one of their cyclists had a consistent sleep on the same bed. And within 5 years of Brailsford taking over the British cycling team, they won 60% of the gold medals available at the 2008 Beijing Olympics. They then later set 9 Olympic records and 7 world records at the London Olympic Games. And that same year, Bradley Wiggins became the first British cyclist to win the Tour de France. A year later, Chris Froome, another British cyclist, won it, and again in 2015, 2016 and 2017. The British cycling team went from no wins ever to 4 years in a row. And during the 10-year span from 2007 to 2017, British cyclists won 178 world championships and 66 Olympic or Paralympic gold medals and captured 5 Tour de France victories in what is widely regarded as the most successful run in cycling history. So the experience you design for your people is what will lead for success with your business. If your people aren't well and cared for, if your business isn't thriving, while every single employee has an experience at work, most of us don't stop to think about how that experience is designed. You're all experts in chairs and desks and product design. You all understand that when we design with empathy, we create great products. Large successful organizations like Apple have empathy as a design principle, and it's one of the reasons why they're so successful. So I implore everybody listening, no matter where you are in the world or how many people you employ, to think about the experience your people have with you. From the day they see your brand or walk into a showroom, or the day they come in for an interview with you, what is that experience like? Is it positive? Is it supportive? Is it kind? Because when you consider and design for these things, that's when you get the best commitment and loyalty and work from your people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gethin, for that. There's some really powerful and thought-provoking information there. We've got some questions that have come in. So the first one, are there any trends in types or sizes of organisations who treat employees well?
It's a great question. So what we used to see is when the research began, it was largely based around the idea that some of the really big successful organizations like Google, Apple, LinkedIn, Microsoft, because of their sheer size and the revenue they generated, they could afford to be a bit more experimental. So they had the time and the resource and the money to try these things to see what an impact it had. And so as it started, that's what we started to see was lots of these big progressive organizations started to drive those trends just because they had the resource to do it. But actually, right across the board now in any country, whether you employ 2 people or 2,000 people, 200,000 people, we can see exactly the same thing. And at Benefex, we've got 400 customers right across the globe in 56 countries, ranging from 500 employees up to kind of 120,000 employees. And there is no trend. This applies no matter what organization size you are.
Cool. Another question, is there a formula for what constitutes a great employee experience?
Another really good question. So there's a great book by a gentleman called Jacob Morgan, which talks about employee experience design and all of the research that he did globally. So he spoke to really big organizations, you know, kind of Cisco, Google's, all those kind of things. And one of the things that he found is that it's a combination of a number of different things. And that was the physical workplace, so where people go to work and how they interact with each other. The technology they use at work, obviously that's a really big part of the business. The culture, so how people feel working for you. Those 3 things really is what he found contribute to the overall experience. So if you're going to really focus at any one point on each thing, each one of those things, that's where you will start to kind of get success. You know, the kind of work that we do at Benefex is driven around the idea that technology needs to be intuitive and easy to use. If you have to log on to multiple different systems, if it's really difficult for you to book a day off because you need to fill out a form and hand it to a manager and that kind of stuff, that's not a great experience. And if you think about how important technology is, if you look at consumer technology, and lots of the listeners will be familiar with this, if I went onto Amazon, for example, and I couldn't find the product I wanted, if I can't find it within about 30 seconds, the research tells me I'll stop looking and I'll go somewhere else. And so that experience employees are having at home with technology is the experience, they're setting the expectation of the experience they want at work with the technology. So people don't want to have to use an Oracle system and a Workday system and a different HR and payroll system. They don't want to have to log into multiple systems and remember multiple passwords. They want everything to be easy to use and intuitive. So where Benefex comes from is we're trying to focus on that technology piece. Obviously, what Herman Miller's trying to do is create that workplace experience. And lots of the stuff that I've covered today will help you cover off lots of that cultural aspects. So how do you create that kind of kind, supportive environment?
Cool. Another question. What impact do you think the physical workplace has on people? So the physical environment.
So really significant. So I think, you know, I'm one of the people that has been pushing for remote and home working and giving people that choice for 10 years or so. And I think obviously as soon as the pandemic came, we forced people to do that. But I think it's important to think that because so many people now have experience of working from home, it's not the same as my experience over the last 10 years. You know, what we've seen people do today is you are working at home in a pandemic. So this isn't working at home in the traditional sense. You've got the stress and the anxiety of a pandemic, and most people aren't set up. So what I expect to see in the future is that if employees like working from home, the next house they move into, the next apartment they rent, they will think about where's my desk going to go and where's my workspace going to be. But at the moment, they don't have that, and that's been thrust upon them. And I spoke at the last Herman Miller Insights event a couple of months ago about how actually I think the workplace is going to start to become this place that gives us the things we can't get at home. So the workplace, I think, will be designed around collaboration, mixing with other people, innovation, group work, building that community well-being and those emotional connections. So I think that workplace is going to become even more significant. So it will change, it won't be the same, but the offices that you guys are all creating and helping to create I think will become a whole different set of important part of the employee experience.
Cool. Another question. Did you have evidence of significant changes of how companies treat their employees after COVID? Whoops, hang on, I'm just reading this. So do you have any evidence of significant changes as to how companies treat their employees after COVID and how that has accelerated the importance of employees' well-being, people caring issues?
Yeah, absolutely. It's made such a significant difference. It's been the busiest 12 months of my professional career, because overnight employers realized they needed to help their people. The people were working from home in a pandemic. We knew mental health impact of this pandemic was going to be significant. So overnight employers wanted to help. And interestingly, what we started to see right across the world is the first month of the pandemic, so starting from kind of April onwards, employee engagement scores around the world went up. So what we started to see was about 2/3 of employers said that their employee engagement scores had gone up during the pandemic. And part of the reason is because we started acting like we cared about our people. So people sent out surveys, they got their CEOs to do video calls with all their employees. They had all employee meetings every week where people could kind of, we were encouraging more connection. We were acting like we cared about our people more. So that was why employee engagement went up, because we actually started doing the things most employees should have been doing all the way along. But what we started to see come July is that started to drop. And employees were reporting that they were about 20% less likely to say their employer cared about them than at the start of the pandemic. So as we got used to the situation, that leveled off. All those activities the flow of activity employees did at the start just started to tail off. But if we look at all the research, and I've obviously covered some of it in this deck, the number one thing that employers say that they need to focus on for 2021, and CEOs say they need to focus on for 2021, is well-being. And it's massively accelerated. We have one of the pieces of technology we do is a benefits platform where employees can come on and choose retirement options, 401ks, pensions, health benefits, health insurance, all this kind of stuff. And we've seen significant spikes right across the board of employers wanting to spend more on well-being. And when we look at the impact, the mental health impact we know will happen on the back of this pandemic, it's going to be significant. So right across the world, mental health is massively underfunded and on the rise. The pandemic has accelerated that so much that around 10% of people who've never had a mental health issue in the past now have said they've had one in the last 12 months. And if we look at the research from parts of Asia during the SARS and MERS outbreaks in 2003, we know the long-term effect of locking people down, and that isolation will be seen for years to come. We can see with parts of the Ukraine when they had kind of the Chernobyl incident. 25 years later, people were still suffering from mental health. Hurricane Katrina in the US, 5 years later, the communities were still suffering from mental health. And so I think it's important employers realise that what employees have gone through this year, even if this pandemic hasn't materially affected them that much, they're going through trauma, and the runoff of that is going to be seen for some years to come. And so I think employers really need to kind of invest more in well-being to support what's coming, even when the pandemic's been vaccinated against, is going to be with us for quite a few years.
Cool. There's another question just in as well. So at Herman Miller, we have get-togethers on an individual basis, but there's a suggestion that would, like your this, would it be a good idea to have get-togethers? This is around looking forward, what worked well in the last quarter versus how you're going to move that forward into the next quarter. The question here is around, would you see a value in moving that to more a team-based get-together and thought-provoking exercise rather than at the moment it purely being on an individual basis?
So it's a really good question. I think, we are, after 11 months of this, we're all pretty zoomed out. We've done a lot of this kind of stuff, what was a novelty at the start. Some of this will be really useful tool for us in the future so that people don't have to make unnecessary trips. People don't have to miss meetings because they can't get from A to B quick enough. So I think video will become a really good tool. I think what people will really want and what we need to really think about is, as we get back to whatever normal was and we stop having to kind of have so much remote meetings, how do we get people to feel like they're part of something? How do we create that community at work? And I think part of that is when we start to understand the people we work with from a human level, so we understand what worries them, kind of, are they married? Do they have kids? You know, kind of, are they looking after an elderly parent with dementia that we know nothing about? You know, when we start to understand what's happening in their lives and kind of walk a mile in their shoes, we start to better support each other and be there. And that leads to kind of increasing psychological safety and increasing performance. So I think any way you can encourage people to build bonds and stronger relationships, whether it's digital or face-to-face, whatever one you can do, I think it's really important that we continue to do that. You know, the camaraderie that we felt at work and in our communities at home throughout the pandemic is because we all feel like we're in this together. We see that in times of war. We see that in times of kind of whenever, you know, big post 9/11, for example, post 9/11 around the world, suicides almost dropped to nothing because we all felt like we were facing a common enemy. We all felt like we were in it together. And it was the same during the Second World War. So when people feel like they're in something together, when they feel like they're part of something, they become much more resilient. So I think it's really important that you keep doing that whatever way that you can.
Great. So that's it on the questions front, Gethin. Thank you so much for your time and taking the trouble to do the presentation today. As I said, there's some really powerful and thought-provoking information in there, which I'm sure everybody will take away with them. We've posted the link to your book in the chat, so anybody that wants to follow up on that, please do. And yeah, thank you very much once again.
Thank you for having me. Thanks, everyone.